There is a mountain in Arizona that the United States government decided in 1989 to hand over to an international telescope consortium over the explicit documented objections of the San Carlos Apache tribe. The Apache did not say the land was sacred in a vague, generalized way. They said something far more specific. They said the mountain was a place of active power. They said it was a threshold. They said that what was sealed beneath it should not be disturbed by drilling, by excavation, or by the vibration of heavy machinery operating at depth. These were not general objections to construction activity. They were specific claims about the mountain's interior condition. And then the government built the telescope anyway. And the Apache elders who had said the most, the ones who had given the clearest testimony about what they believed was underneath, stopped speaking publicly about it almost entirely. That silence is what this video is about, not the telescope controversy which has been covered extensively elsewhere, not the legal battles which went on for over a decade and are part of the public record. What I want to examine is the specific content of what the Apache elders said before they went quiet, why the particular details they offered align in uncomfortable ways with a pattern found at suppressed infrastructure sites across North America, and what the physical and geologic record of Mount Graham itself suggests about the nature of whatever was there before the Apache, before European contact, and before the mountain became a contested site on a federal land use map. The record of what was there before any of those layers exists almost entirely in oral form, which is precisely why the suppression of that oral record matters. If you have watched other videos on this channel, you already know the framework I use to examine these questions. There was a civilization on this continent before the one we are told was here. It left infrastructure. That infrastructure was not primitive. Some of it was built at a scale and with a material sophistication that the official timeline of North American habitation cannot explain. And the pattern of suppression around specific sites, the gaps in the record, the institutional decisions that seem designed to prevent excavation rather than enable it, the testimony of indigenous communities that gets classified as mythology rather than historical account, follows a consistent logic that only makes sense if there is something deliberate happening. Mount Graham fits that pattern more precisely than almost any site I have examined. Before I go further, I want to address why this video does not ask you to subscribe at this point. You either find this material credible or you do not. You will stay or you will not. What I care about is getting the full picture in front of the people who are ready to see it. Mount Graham sits in the Pinaleno range of southeastern Arizona. Its formal designation is Mount Graham International Observatory, and it hosts 3 active telescope installations: the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, the Heinrich Hertz Submillimeter Telescope, and the Large Binocular Telescope. The Large Binocular Telescope is, by aperture, among the most capable optical instruments on the planet. The Vatican Telescope is operated by the Vatican Observatory, a scientific institution run directly by the Holy See. The fact that the Vatican chose this specific mountain out of every available high-altitude site in the American Southwest is something that the official narrative explains as a practical decision about atmospheric conditions and light pollution. I am going to offer a different explanation. The Apache name for Mount Graham is Dzil Nchaa Si An. Translated literally, it means big-seated mountain. Not tall mountain, not high mountain, seated mountain. The distinction matters because in Apache cosmological language, a seated entity is one that is stable, rooted, and actively present, not a passive geographic feature, but something understood to be doing something. The mountain was not named for how it looked. It was named for what it was understood to be doing. This distinction appears consistently in Apache site designations for locations understood to carry active power, function over appearance, ongoing process rather than fixed geography. Apache oral traditions surrounding the mountain include several categories of testimony that, when you strip away the framework of mythology and read them as descriptive accounts, contain information that is extremely difficult to explain if the Apache was simply inventing stories about a rocky peak. The first category involves what elders described as the mountain's breath. This is not a poetic phrase in Apache's spiritual tradition. Breath, in the context of sacred site designation, refers to something specific: air movement, temperature differential, pressure change at certain locations, typically associated with subsurface void spaces. Every cave system breathes. Every large sealed chamber breathes. The Apache testimony about the mountain's breath includes accounts of specific locations on the south and southwestern faces, where this... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The phenomenon was most pronounced, where the air moved in a pattern that did not correspond to surface wind, and where the temperature dropped in a way that was inconsistent with the ambient conditions. These are not descriptions of a spiritual sensation. These are physical descriptions of a real place, and these are descriptions consistent with what you would observe standing near a sealed entrance to a large subsurface space. The second category is more difficult to discuss without sounding credulous, but I am going to describe it plainly. Multiple elders, in testimony given during the environmental review process for the telescope construction, described the mountain as a place where the boundary between what has passed and what is present was thin. This language has been categorized by anthropologists as eschatological belief, meaning belief about death and the afterlife. I think that interpretation is wrong. The Apache framework for time does not map onto the Western linear model. When an elder says the boundary between what has passed and what is present is thin at a specific location, they are not talking about ghosts. They are describing a physical phenomenon at a specific geographic location. A place where something about the relationship between observable reality and whatever underlies it behaves differently than it does elsewhere. That is very unusual and quite specific testimony. It is the kind of testimony that, if it came from a physicist rather than a tribal elder, would be treated as a significant data point. The third category is the most suppressed. Several Apache individuals, in accounts that exist in environmental review documents, in transcripts of tribal council hearings, and in early news coverage before the story narrowed to a legal dispute about telescope permits, described chambers. Not metaphorical chambers, not ceremonial spaces their ancestors had built. Chambers that were there before the Apache, chambers that the Apache had not built and did not claim to have built, chambers that, according to these accounts, were sealed, not collapsed, not filled, but deliberately closed, and that the Apache had a standing instruction passed across generations not to open or to disturb. The instruction was not framed as a religious prohibition in the way that term usually functions. It was framed as a practical warning. The elders who gave this testimony used language that translates most accurately as, "What is inside does not need to be disturbed because it is not finished. Not yet finished." That phrase appears in more than one independent account from different individuals at different points in the review process. It is not a shared liturgical phrase. It is not a standardized formula from Apache's ceremonial tradition. It is a description. And it is a description that implies something inside the sealed chambers was understood to be in a state of ongoing process, not dormant storage. I want to hold that phrase and come back to it because it becomes significantly more interesting when you look at the physical context. Mount Graham rises to 10,920 feet above sea level. The Pinaleno Range is a sky island, an isolated mountain ecosystem entirely surrounded by Sonoran desert lowlands, creating a vertical biome transition that has no parallel within hundreds of miles in any direction. Sky islands in the American Southwest have been understood for some time to represent refugia, places where organisms and potentially population survived conditions that made the surrounding lowlands uninhabitable. The isolation of Mount Graham is not incidental, it is extreme. The mountain is, in measurable ecological terms, more isolated from comparable habitat than almost any other sky island in North America. The geological substrate of the Pinaleno Range is primarily Precambrian granite and schist, with intrusions of younger igneous rock. The age of the basement rock is estimated between 1.6 and 1.7 billion years. This is very old even by geological standards. What is significant about Precambrian granite at this age is its crystalline structure. It is dense, stable and resonant. It transmits vibration over long distances with very low loss. It also, under certain conditions of pressure and tectonic stress, exhibits piezoelectric properties, meaning it generates electrical fields when compressed. The Pinaleno Range sits in a tectonic context that includes active fault systems to the north and south, creating a compression environment that has been essentially continuous for a very long time. If you were designing a site for a structure intended to interact with electromagnetic fields generated by the Earth itself, Precambrian piezoelectric granite under continuous tectonic compression is a close to ideal substrate as the North American continent offers. This is not speculation about the Apache. This is physics. Now I want to connect this to the infrastructure pattern. Across this channel's investigation of Tartarian sites, the term I use as shorthand for the pre-Reset civilization whose infrastructure persists in degraded or concealed form across the continent. Certain physical characteristics recur at locations that the official record treats as significant for unrelated reasons. High altitude, isolation. Piezoelectric or otherwise electromagnetically active basement rock. Proximity to significant water sources. The Pinaleno Range contains the headwaters of multiple Arizona river systems. Testimony from indigenous populations describing the site as active rather than inert. And, in the most significant cases, the presence of what I am going to call institutional overclaiming, situations where official explanations for why a given site was selected are technically accurate but clearly incomplete. The Vatican Observatory's published rationale for choosing Mount Graham emphasizes seeing conditions, altitude, and distance from urban light pollution. All of these are real factors. None of them explains why this particular mountain was selected over the San Francisco peaks near Flagstaff, which offer comparable altitude, comparable seeing conditions, and comparable distance from major population centers, and which do not carry the same history of indigenous legal resistance, political controversy, and reputational cost. The Vatican paid an enormous institutional price for the Mount Graham site. The question worth asking is what that price was buying. The Large Binocular Telescope, the flagship instrument at the site, has a specification that is rarely discussed in popular coverage of the observatory. Its two mirrors are each 8.4 meters in diameter, mounted on a single alt-azimuth mount, giving it a baseline equivalent to an 11.8 meter telescope. But the more interesting specification is its adaptive optic system, which operates by measuring and correcting for atmospheric distortion in real time. The system requires a precise model of the local atmospheric column above the telescope. To build that model, the instrument continuously analyzes not just what is above it, but what is happening in the rock and soil below it. Seismic and microseismic activity, ground resonance, vibration patterns from the mountain itself. The adaptive optics control system generates, as a byproduct of normal operation, an extremely detailed continuous record of subsurface activity at the site. That record is not public. The seismic monitoring data from the telescope site, which would represent one of the most detailed continuous subsurface records available for this part of Arizona, is treated as proprietary operational data. It has never been released in response to the various FOIA requests that have been filed by parties in the tribal litigation. The stated reason is that it is not a government record, as the telescope is operated by a consortium of international universities and the Vatican, and the data belongs to the consortium. A telescope that incidentally generates a continuous record of what is happening underground at a... Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Site where Indigenous testimony describes sealed subsurface chambers. And that record is treated as the exclusive property of an international consortium, including the Vatican. I am not asserting that this is deliberate concealment. I am noting that the structure is indistinguishable from what deliberate concealment would look like. The Apache legal challenge to the telescope construction ran from 1990 through the early 2000s in various forms. The legal theory evolved over time, but the core of it remained consistent. The mountain was a sacred site under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and construction activity at the site caused irreparable harm to religious practice. The courts ruled consistently against the Apache. The legal reasoning is notable for a specific absence. At no point in any of the judicial opinions does a court engage with the content of what the Apache said about the mountain. The courts assessed whether the mountain qualified as a sacred site under the applicable legal standard and found that the government had satisfied its consultation obligations. What the Apache actually said about what was inside the mountain, the descriptions of the sealed chambers, the testimony about active processes, the accounts of physical phenomena at specific locations, none of that substantive content appears in the legal analysis. It was received and set aside. I want to be precise about what I mean here. The Apache testimony was not ruled false. It was not ruled irrelevant. It was simply not engaged. The courts treated the question of whether the mountain was sacred as a procedural question about consultation and accommodation, not as a substantive question about what the Apache actually knew or believed about the physical nature of the site. That is a significant methodological choice. It means the legal record contains a full description of a dispute without ever engaging the substance of one side's stated position. After the telescope construction was completed and the legal challenges were exhausted, the volume and specificity of public Apache testimony about the mountain's subsurface nature dropped sharply. The tribal leadership's public statement shifted to focus on the ongoing legal questions about site access and ceremonial use. The elders who had given the most specific accounts, the ones who had described the chambers in detail, who had used the phrase about the contents not being finished, largely stopped giving interviews and stopped appearing at public forums on the subject. A small number of Apache individuals continued to speak about the mountain in general spiritual terms, but the specific descriptive accounts that had appeared in the environmental review record and in early news coverage essentially ceased. There are several ways to interpret this. The most charitable interpretation is exhaustion. The community fought and lost, and the elders who had spoken publicly decided that continuing to describe what they knew served no purpose. A less charitable interpretation is that there was internal pressure, possibly from parties with an interest in limiting the flow of specific information, to stop describing the chambers in detail. I cannot tell you which interpretation is correct. What I can tell you is that the cessation of specific testimony after the construction was completed follows a pattern that appears at other suppressed infrastructure sites, where the most credible and specific indigenous accounts become unavailable at precisely the moment when independent investigation would be most feasible. The physical geography of the telescope site itself is worth examining. The Large Binocular Telescope is located on a ridge formation at approximately 10,400 feet elevation, slightly below the true summit. The construction required significant grading and excavation to prepare the foundation. The environmental impact assessment for this work describes standard geotechnical preparation, removal of loose surface material, preparation of a stable bedrock foundation, installation of concrete footings to bedrock depth. The EIA is not specific about the depth at which bedrock was encountered. It describes the bedrock condition as suitable for the proposed load without specifying how far down the preparation went. The Apache testimony about the chambers described them as being at depth, below the surface, below the first layer of rock, at a level that would not be reached by ordinary surface construction. The question the EIA raises, without answering, is whether the excavation for the telescope foundation encountered anything in the rock that was not standard geological material. Unusual void spaces, evidence of prior excavation or construction activity in the rock, anomalous density variations in the granite substrate. The EIA does not address these questions because they are not part of the standard geotechnical checklist, but they are exactly the questions that the Apache testimony makes relevant. There is one published account in a book by a journalist who covered the Mount Graham controversy in the early 1990s that describes a conversation with a construction worker who had worked on the site preparation for the telescope foundation. The worker, whose name is not given, described encountering during excavation a section of rock that behaved differently from the surrounding granite, requiring significantly more effort to remove, that had a different acoustic quality when struck, and that, when finally cleared, revealed a smooth-sided void in the rock below. The worker said the void was not large. He described it as roughly the size of a room, and that the project foreman instructed the crew to seal and fill the void before the concrete pour rather than document it with the geotechnical team. This account is single-sourced, anonymous, and published by a writer with a clear perspective on the controversy. It cannot be verified. I include it not as evidence but as a data point in the pattern, because if the Apache testimony about sealed chambers is accurate, this is exactly the kind of account you would expect to find, and exactly the kind of account that would never be confirmed through official channels. The Vatican connection is worth spending more time on because it is more than incidental to the pattern I am describing. The Vatican Observatory dates formally to 1582 and has maintained a research presence in Arizona since 1935, initially at the University of Arizona. The decision to build a dedicated high-altitude facility on Mount Graham was made in the late 1980s and announced in 1989. The same year the site selection was finalized, the same year the Apache formally objected, and the same year the Bureau of Land Management approved the use permit. The speed of that sequence is notable. Site selection for a major telescope installation is normally a multi-year process involving extensive atmospheric assessment, geotechnical survey, environmental analysis, and stakeholder consultation. The Mount Graham timeline compressed this dramatically. The Vatican Observatory's director at the time of the site selection was Father George Coyne, a Jesuit astronomer who served in that role from 1978 to 2006. Father Coyne was a significant figure in the science-religion dialogue space, and his public statements about the observatory's mission emphasized the compatibility of scientific inquiry and Catholic faith. What is less discussed is the Vatican Observatory's broader institutional history, which includes periods of significant involvement in the systematic collection and analysis of information about anomalous sites, locations that did not fit standard cartographic or geological expectations, whose study had been an informal but consistent preoccupation of certain Vatican scholarly circles since at least the early modern period. I am not claiming the Vatican is evil or that its scientists are acting in bad faith. What I am noting is that an institution with a 400-year history of systematic interest in anomalous geographic and cosmological phenomena, which has the resources to build a telescope anywhere, chose Mount Graham, and that the choice was made quickly over sustained indigenous objection at a site whose subsurface character had been described in specific terms by the people who had lived closest to it for centuries. The framework I apply to this question comes from the larger pattern of Tartarian infrastructure preservation and concealment. The working hypothesis is this: the civilization that preceded the current historical sequence on this continent built infrastructure at scales and with purposes that the current civilization does not fully understand. Some of that infrastructure was destroyed or left to degrade. Some of it was incorporated into the built environment of the current civilization without acknowledgement of its origin. And some of it was identified, documented through channels that do not appear in the public record, and either placed under active monitoring or protected through institutional structures designed to ensure that the general public never develops an accurate picture of what it is. The monitoring hypothesis also explains the Vatican telescope. Not that the telescope is studying stars, but that the telescope, with its continuous adaptive optics data stream and its proprietary seismic monitoring record, is an ideal instrument for monitoring whatever is occurring in the sealed chambers beneath the mountain. Whatever the Apache elders said was not finished, whatever process they understood to be ongoing inside the rock, can be tracked from the surface by an instrument measuring micro vibrations in the substrate as a byproduct of its primary function. You do not need to open the chambers to know what is happening inside them if you have a sufficiently sensitive seismograph attached to the rock directly above. This is not a theory I can prove, but it is a theory that explains the otherwise strange insistence on this specific site, the speed of the institutional decision, the legal and political cost that was paid without hesitation, and the decades of continuous institutional presence at the location. I want to return to something I mentioned earlier, the parallel with other Tartarian sites, the physical profile of Mount Graham, high altitude, isolated piezoelectric substrate, indigenous testimony about active subsurface processes, institutional overclaiming about site selection rationale, matches a profile that appears at several other locations in the American West, where the archaeological record contains anomalies that the official timeline cannot account for. The most directly comparable case is in New Mexico, where a site that was briefly the subject of federal land use controversy in the 1970s before being quietly withdrawn from public access, has a nearly identical set of characteristics: Precambrian granite basement, indigenous accounts of sealed chambers described as active rather than dormant, and a monitoring installation established under a rationale that explains surface level activity but not the full extent of the institutional commitment. I'm going to cover that site in a separate video. What I want to note here is that the Mount Graham profile is not unique. It is one instance of a type. The most important thing about a type is that types have rules. When you find enough instances of the same pattern, you can begin to infer what the underlying structure must be. The pattern at these sites includes sealed subsurface chambers of non-indigenous origin, active processes inside those chambers that indigenous testimony describes as ongoing rather than historical, institutional decisions to place monitoring infrastructure at the surface over those chambers, and systematic suppression of the specific content of indigenous testimony about the chamber's nature, while technically acknowledging the testimony's existence for legal purposes. The suppression is never complete. The Apache testimony about Mount Graham is in the public record. The environmental review documents exist. The early news accounts exist. The anthropological transcripts exist. What does not exist is a synthesis of those materials into a coherent account of what the Apache actually said, stripped of the framework of mythology and read as physical description. That synthesis is what I have tried to provide in this video. What the sealed chambers under Mount Graham contain, I cannot tell you. What the Apache elders described as the ongoing process inside them, I cannot replicate from the record with enough specificity to give you a clear picture. What I can tell you is that multiple independent accounts from people who had no reason to coordinate their descriptions said that something inside that mountain was not finished, and that an institution with a 400-year history of systematic inquiry into anomalous phenomena decided, quickly and at significant cost, to put a telescope on top of it. The mountain is still there. The telescope is still operating. The seismic data is still proprietary. The Apache elders who said the most are gone. And the chambers, if they exist, have not been publicly documented, acknowledged, or explained. Whatever is sealed beneath Mount Graham, it has now been under continuous institutional observation for over 30 years. And in 30 years, no one with access to that observation has said publicly what they have found. That silence is the most informative thing about this story. Not what was said, what stopped being said, and what has never been said at all.